It's funny how sometimes you go through life thinking you know everything about a person, only to realize one day that you've been blind to things right in front of your face. I've known Ethan for years now. He's my stepson, has been since he was just a kid. When Mark and I got married, Ethan was only 14, a typical teenager, all awkward limbs and loud laughter, always bouncing around the house, in and out of his room, always needing help with something, whether it was schoolwork, a bike repair, or a ride somewhere. And I've been there for him, helping out, giving advice, trying to be the steady maternal figure in his life. But something happened this summer, and I can't even say when it started, or exactly how. It was like it happened overnight, like someone flipped a switch in my mind, and suddenly, I couldn't stop noticing the way he'd changed. I remember the first moment it hit me. It was one of those unbearably hot days, the kind where you couldn't escape the humidity no matter how many fans you had on. Ethan had been out running, doing one of his usual workouts, and he came back home dripping with sweat. He'd always been fit, but there was something different about him that day. He'd shed that gangly, awkward teenage body and grown into something else entirely. His muscles were more defined now, his arms thickened with strength, his chest broader. The way his shirt clung to his body is stark contrast to the skinny teenager I remembered. When I saw him standing in the doorway, shirtless, as he wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, I was struck. He looked like a man. And it wasn't just his body, but the way he held himself, like he was comfortable in his skin, no longer unsure about who he was. That confidence, that quiet, assured way he moved around the house, it made my heart race a little, in a way I wasn't prepared for. I didn't think much of it at first, chalking it up to the heat, the exhaustion of the day. I turned away quickly, trying to push the thought out of my head. But it kept creeping back. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop noticing the little things. The way he moved when he walked into a room, like he was aware of how people looked at him. The way his voice had changed, deeper, with more control, less the high-pitched sound of the boy he once was. And even the way he looked at me sometimes when we were talking. There was a new awareness in his eyes. It was subtle, but it was there. He didn't look at me the way he used to, as just the woman married to his dad. I wasn't sure if he saw me as something else, or if I was just imagining things, but it was definitely different. One afternoon, when I was in the kitchen, I found myself stealing a glance at him as he walked past, his muscles flexing as he reached for something on the top shelf. I thought my heart might skip a beat. He was just moving, just reaching for a cup, but the way his body stretched and moved felt too intimate, too familiar. I quickly turned away, my hands shaking a little as I tried to focus on the pots I was washing, but I knew deep down I wasn't fooling myself. And then there was the night after he got out of the shower. He walked into the living room wearing nothing but a towel wrapped low around his hips. His skin was still damp, the towel barely hanging on as he adjusted it. I could barely focus on anything else but the way his chest gleamed in the light, the way his muscles flexed and shifted as he moved. I wasn't prepared for that. He looked like a stranger, yet so familiar, and the way his presence filled the room. I felt my pulse quicken. I couldn't breathe. I tried to look away, to pretend nothing was out of the ordinary, but my body betrayed me. I told myself it was just the shock of seeing him like that, of seeing him as a man instead of the boy I had known. It shouldn't have mattered, but it did. I kept thinking about it. Even now, weeks later, I can't seem to shake the memory of that moment. Every time I see him, I can't help but notice the change. The way his body fills out a t-shirt. The way he carries himself now, like he's aware of his own power, aware of how the world sees him. And the way he looks at me. It's not the innocent, trusting gaze of the little boy I raised. There's something deeper now, something more intense. It's not like he's trying to make me uncomfortable, but I feel it anyway, and it's been impossible to ignore. Maybe it's just me. Maybe I'm overthinking it. But part of me knows that things have shifted, whether I like it or not. Ethan isn't the boy I once knew. He's a man now, and I'm afraid I've noticed a little too much. It was a Saturday afternoon, one of those rare moments when the house was quiet, and I finally had a chance to myself. I had spent the morning running errands, catching up on laundry, and dealing with a mountain of work. Between being a wife, a stepmother, and managing everything else, I was constantly running on fumes. I was looking forward to a hot shower, a few moments of peace to unwind, to just be alone. The bathroom door clicked shut behind me, and I turned the water on, letting the steam fill the room. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath as the warmth washed over my tired muscles. The sound of the water hitting the tile drowned out the noise of the house, and I let my mind wander, imagining how I'd finally have the evening to myself. I didn't even hear Ethan come home. I was lost in my thoughts, letting the hot water soothe my neck, when I heard the soft, unmistakable sound of footsteps outside the door. They were deliberate, coming closer. I didn't think anything of it at first. Mark was supposed to be home soon, and I assumed it was him. Maybe he had forgotten something and had come back to grab it. I didn't think it would be Ethan. Then, before I could process what was happening, the bathroom door creaked open, just a few inches. The steam from the shower must have fogged up the mirror because the crack in the door gave way to a figure I couldn't place immediately. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I turned and saw Ethan standing there, his eyes wide, mouth open in surprise. I had no time to react. The towel I had hung on the rack was out of reach, my hands frozen to my sides as I stared at him. He was looking at me, his gaze lingering longer than a simple glance, and for a split second I saw something in his eyes. A flash of shock, confusion, and something else I couldn't quite decipher. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was something deeper, but the moment felt like it was suspended in time, as if everything was moving at once, but still so impossibly slow. The awkwardness hit me like a wave. I immediately grabbed for the edge of the shower curtain, but by then, it was too late. He'd already seen me. There was no way to undo it. "Oh God, I'm so sorry," Ethan stammered, his voice cracking as he tried to back away, his face turning a deep shade of red. The door slammed shut behind him with a hurried force, and I was left standing in the middle of the bathroom, my heart hammering in my chest. I stood there for a few long moments, just staring at the door, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I could hear Ethan's footsteps quickly retreating down the hallway, and a part of me wanted to run after him, apologize, make it right. But another part of me, a part I wasn't sure I even wanted to acknowledge, wanted to stay frozen in that moment, to keep feeling what I had felt when our eyes locked. I had to admit it wasn't just the embarrassment that lingered. It wasn't just that Ethan had seen me like that, vulnerable, exposed. It was the way he had looked at me. The way his gaze seemed to linger just a little too long. His shock was real, but so was the way he hesitated before pulling away. I grabbed the towel, wrapping it tightly around myself, but even that couldn't hide the rush of heat that spread across my chest and face. I knew I should be upset, mortified. I should have felt angry that he had intruded on my privacy like that. But all I could think about was the way he had reacted, how he hadn't immediately turned around and apologized, how he hadn't immediately closed the door. Instead, he had stood there for that split second longer than he should have, as if unsure whether to look away or not. It felt like time had stopped. The house was silent, but inside my thoughts were racing. Why hadn't he just turned around? Why hadn't he done what anyone would do in that situation? Apologize and leave immediately. The fact that he had hesitated, that he had lingered, twisted something inside of me. I quickly turned off the water, pulling the towel tighter around me as I tried to calm myself. I thought about running after him, confronting him, asking if he was okay, telling him it was no big deal, trying to make the situation less awkward. But part of me was frozen, unsure of how to act now that this line had been crossed. I walked out of the bathroom slowly, not knowing what to expect. As I reached the hallway, I could hear Ethan moving in his room, the door shut behind him. He was still in there. I knew it wasn't intentional, but there was an undeniable tension in the air now, something I hadn't felt before. I couldn't get the image of his eyes out of my head. The way he'd looked at me, like he hadn't meant to see me like that, but also, maybe, like he hadn't minded. I tried to shake it off. I told myself it was just an accident, that I'd caught him at a weird moment, and he had just reacted awkwardly. I could pretend it didn't matter, but it did matter. It lingered in my mind, uninvited, like a shadow I couldn't escape. I couldn't help but wonder if he had liked what he saw. Was that why he had hesitated? Or was it just my mind running wild? I pushed the thought away, but I couldn't ignore the knot of unease that had settled in my stomach. Things were different now. Something had shifted, and I wasn't sure how to deal with it. The summer months arrived with a surprising sense of calm. Ethan, now back home from college for a few weeks, started spending more time around the house. He had always been a quiet presence before, mostly keeping to himself when he wasn't out with friends or at school, but something had shifted. He wasn't just around more, he was different, more engaged, more open. I noticed it the first time he offered to help me with the gardening. At first, it felt like a small gesture, just a way to fill his time during the break. But it wasn't just about the task, it was about the way he was with me. The conversations that had always been casual or surface level were becoming deeper, more personal. We talked about everything: his college classes, his friends, his future plans. But there was something about the way he shared, like he was letting me into parts of his life he hadn't before. It felt intimate, and it wasn't just the topics themselves, it was the way he looked at me when he spoke, his eyes lingering just a bit longer than they had in the past. It was subtle, like the way he'd shift closer when we were talking, or how he seemed to listen with more attention than I'd remembered. One evening, we were sitting on the back porch after finishing up a few hours of yard work. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, painting the sky with a warm golden hue. The air was thick with the scent of fresh cut grass and the faint hum of crickets. I was tired, but it felt like a good kind of tired, the kind that comes with a sense of accomplishment. "I'm glad I've been helping out more," Ethan said, his voice low and casual as he leaned back in his chair. He was looking out at the yard, but I noticed the way his hands rested on the armrests, his posture more confident than I remembered. It was like he had grown into himself in the time he'd been away. "I've been meaning to get all this done. It's nice to have the extra help," I said, trying to keep my tone light, even though there was something in the air between us, something unspoken. I tried not to think about the way he had looked at me just a moment ago, the way his gaze had lingered on me for an extra second when I had turned to grab something from the table. Ethan chuckled, a sound that was deeper now, more mature. "Yeah, well, it's good to be home. You know, it's different when you come back after being away for a while. You start seeing things differently." I nodded, unsure of how to respond. I had been noticing the same thing. Everything felt different, and not just because of the shift in how much time Ethan was spending here. It was something in the way he was looking at me, the way he seemed to be seeing me in a new light. He was becoming more of a man, and I was beginning to see that clearly now. His body had changed. He wasn't the same skinny kid he had been when I first met him. He had filled out, muscles in his arms, his shoulders broader, his posture more confident. But it wasn't just his appearance that had changed. It was his energy, his presence. It felt like he was stepping into something new, something more grown up. I tried not to let my mind wander too far, but when he caught me looking at him, our eyes met for a split second, and the tension I'd been ignoring all week came rushing back. He didn't say anything, but the silence between us was thick, as if we were both aware of the shift but unsure how to address it. The evening wore on, and we finished cleaning up the porch. As I gathered up the gardening tools, Ethan walked over to help me. His hand brushed against mine briefly as we both reached for the rake, and I felt a shock of awareness rush through me. It wasn't anything overt, nothing that couldn't be brushed off as accidental, but in that moment, I couldn't ignore the way his touch had sent a pulse of electricity through me. I quickly withdrew my hand, trying to hide the way my heart was suddenly racing. Later that night, I found myself lying awake in bed, staring up at the ceiling. My thoughts were spinning. I kept replaying the conversations we'd had, the way his gaze had softened when he looked at me, the way his touch had felt against my skin. He was changing, and I was changing in response to it. I wasn't sure how to process what was happening between us, but it was clear now. Something had shifted. Something was blooming between us, whether I wanted to admit it or not. The next few days passed in a haze, with more quiet moments between us. Ethan continued to help around the house, and each time we were alone, the tension grew. There was a new dynamic now, a bond that hadn't existed before. I could feel the weight of it, even if we didn't speak about it directly. It was in the way we shared space, the way we interacted. Each moment felt like it could tip in one direction or the other, but neither of us seemed to want to name what was happening. I didn't know what to do with the growing connection between us. I tried to bury it, telling myself that it was just a phase, that it would pass. But the truth was, every time we spoke, every time we shared a moment, it was getting harder and harder to ignore the way my body responded to him, the way my emotions seemed to be unraveling with each passing day. The summer was supposed to be a time to relax, to recharge, but instead, it felt like the ground beneath me was shifting, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could stand still before everything started to crumble. The tension between Ethan and me had been growing for weeks, and though we both tried to pretend it wasn't there, it was becoming impossible to ignore. It wasn't just his physical presence anymore, though to be honest, I could hardly deny how different he looked. It was the way he acted around me, the way his gaze seemed to linger just a little longer than it used to, the way his voice had dropped an octave in recent months, giving it a new depth I wasn't used to. One evening, after we had finished dinner, we decided to watch a movie in the living room. I was tired from a long day, but the idea of spending time with Ethan, of being in the same space with him, felt almost necessary now. It had become a ritual. He would come downstairs and we'd share the couch in silence for a while before the movie began. But this time, it was different. As we sat down, I could feel the change in the air. The usual comfortable distance between us had been replaced by something else. He didn't sit across from me like he usually did. Instead, he took the seat beside me, his body close enough that I could feel the heat radiating off him. I told myself it was nothing, just a casual choice, nothing more. But my heart rate increased as he settled into the space next to me. I had always appreciated his company. We'd shared a bond over the years, talking about everything from trivial things like movies and books to deeper topics like his future, his plans. But now, those conversations had taken on a new tone. There were moments when his words felt like they were meant only for me, when his eyes met mine with a depth that I couldn't quite explain. His gaze didn't flicker away as quickly as it used to, and the silence between us felt heavy, like it carried unspoken words that neither of us dared to say. That night, as the movie started, something shifted. Our hands brushed as we both reached for the remote, and the touch was electric. So subtle, so small, but so powerful. I couldn't pull my hand away immediately, even though I knew I should. He didn't either. For just a brief moment, our fingers lingered, and I felt a rush of something that felt completely out of place. I turned my head, pretending to focus on the screen, hoping the awkwardness would pass. But I couldn't shake the feeling that things had changed between us, that our relationship had crossed some invisible line. The dynamic that had once been so simple, stepmother and stepson, wasn't simple anymore. And what was worse, I couldn't figure out how to handle it. Ethan, for his part, seemed unaffected. He continued to watch the movie, but I could sense a quiet undercurrent in his demeanor. It was in the way he glanced at me when he thought I wasn't looking, in the way his leg brushed against mine as he shifted in his seat. It was subtle, but it was there, undeniable. I tried to ignore the growing tension, but the longer we sat there together, the harder it became. My thoughts were running wild, and my pulse quickened whenever he got too close, whenever our hands brushed again, even if it was an accident. I kept telling myself that it was nothing, that it didn't mean anything. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. We didn't speak much for the rest of the movie. We sat in silence, the screen flickering in front of us, but my mind was elsewhere. It was with Ethan. It was with the way his body felt next to mine, the way his breath seemed to match mine in rhythm. Every time he moved, every time our legs or arms touched, I couldn't help but feel that heat between us again. As the credits rolled, he stood up to leave, and I couldn't quite look him in the eye. My stomach twisted with something I couldn't quite name. I forced myself to smile, to act normal, to act like this was all fine. But as I watched him walk out of the room, my heart was pounding in my chest. The space between us felt different now. The boundaries we had carefully maintained for so long were starting to blur, and neither of us seemed to know how to stop it. I sat there alone, the room suddenly too quiet. The lingering warmth from where his body had been close to mine still hung in the air, and I could feel the tension tightening around my chest, like I was holding my breath. How long could I keep pretending nothing had changed? How long could I keep ignoring what was happening between us? The air between Ethan and me had changed. even if neither of us had openly acknowledged it. For the past few weeks, I'd been hyper-aware of every look, every glance, every subtle movement. At first, it was just a strange feeling, like a flicker of something new, something unfamiliar, but now it was becoming harder to ignore. Ethan had grown so much in the past year, not just physically, but emotionally too. The young boy I had known for so long was slowly becoming a man, and with that shift, everything between us felt like it was shifting too. I had always prided myself on keeping things in their proper place, on maintaining clear boundaries between myself and my family. But lately, those boundaries were becoming harder to define. It wasn't just his physical presence, though God, his broad shoulders and strong frame were undeniable now. It was the way he carried himself. The way he looked at me sometimes, as if he saw something in me that I wasn't sure I was ready to confront. His eyes had changed too. They were no longer those innocent eyes of a teenager. They were dark, full of quiet intensity, as if he was quietly studying me, figuring me out in ways that made my skin prickle. That night, the change in our dynamic was palpable. Ethan had come downstairs after dinner, and we decided to watch a movie. I hadn't expected it to feel any different than usual. It was a routine we'd shared many times over the years, just me and him, sitting side by side, passing the time. But this time, I could feel it in my bones, the shift in the air. He didn't sit across the room like he used to. He didn't give me the space I had become accustomed to. Instead, he plopped down right next to me, close enough that our legs brushed, and I could feel the heat of his body radiating against mine. The sensation was overwhelming, almost suffocating. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just overthinking it. But as he settled in, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different, that something unspoken was passing between us. I tried to push it aside, to ignore the racing thoughts in my head. I had to. I wasn't about to make this complicated. But the closer he sat, the harder it became. His body was relaxed, yet there was an underlying tension in the way he held himself, like he was deliberately drawing closer to me, testing the waters. I told myself to focus on the movie, to take my mind off the situation, but his presence was all-consuming, and I couldn't stop noticing it. As the movie played on, I couldn't help but notice the small things, the way he would occasionally glance over at me when he thought I wasn't looking, how his knee brushed against mine every time he shifted. I tried to pretend like it didn't affect me, that it was all perfectly normal, but inside I was a mess. It was like every little touch, every glance, was a spark, igniting something I wasn't ready to confront. The real moment of change, the moment I knew things were no longer simple, came when our hands brushed. It was so innocent, so accidental, but it felt like everything in me stilled for a fraction of a second. We both reached for the same cushion at the same time, and our hands collided. I pulled mine away quickly, trying to act as if it was nothing, but I could see the slight smile tug at the corner of Ethan's lips. It was as if he knew exactly what had just happened, exactly what that touch had meant, and for a moment, I could feel the weight of it settle between us, heavy and undeniable. I didn't know what to do with myself. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, forcing my attention back on the movie, but the tension was still there, hanging in the air like a thick fog. The movie was nothing more than background noise to the storm raging in my head. Ethan wasn't just sitting beside me anymore. He was present, in a way he hadn't been before. And as much as I tried to keep things casual, I couldn't ignore the fact that I was feeling something I didn't want to feel. For the next few minutes, I stole glances at him when I thought he wasn't looking. I tried to make sense of what was happening between us, but all I could come up with was a knot in my stomach. Was this really happening? Was I really feeling this way about my stepson? I was both terrified and intrigued, drawn to him in a way that I couldn't understand and certainly couldn't justify. We sat there side by side, in that suffocating silence, neither of us saying anything, but both of us knowing that something had shifted. It was impossible to ignore now. Ethan seemed content to let the silence stretch on, as if he was giving me space to process whatever this was. But I couldn't process it. I couldn't wrap my head around what was happening, and the longer I sat there, the harder it became to pretend it was nothing. When the movie ended, Ethan got up without a word, his movements casual, as though nothing had changed. I, on the other hand, stayed frozen for a moment, trying to calm my racing heart. His presence still lingered in the room, and I was left alone with the overwhelming realization that things between us were no longer simple. I had felt it then. The shift, the change, the moment when everything became complicated, and now there was no going back. As I sat there, replaying the evening in my mind, I knew that this was only the beginning. Whatever this was between Ethan and me, it wasn't something that would go away. It was only going to get more difficult to ignore, and soon, I wouldn't be able to pretend like nothing had changed. It had been a long week, filled with an unsettling mix of tension and avoidance. I tried to act normal, to return to the routine of our everyday lives, but the space between Ethan and me had become too thick with unspoken words. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I couldn't pretend I hadn't noticed the subtle ways he'd started acting around me, the quiet moments we shared that felt charged with something I couldn't name. And I knew he had noticed too. That evening after dinner, when Mark had retreated to the office to work on his latest project, Ethan and I found ourselves alone in the kitchen, washing dishes together. It had been a familiar, quiet ritual, but tonight it felt different. The sound of water running and the clink of plates against the sink was almost too loud in the thick silence between us. I kept my gaze focused on the plates in my hands, trying to ignore the way my pulse raced with every breath I took. "Grace," Ethan said softly, breaking the quiet. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, something deeper that I hadn't heard before. I glanced up at him, a little surprised by the seriousness in his tone. He wasn't looking at the dishes, or the counter, or anything else that usually captured his attention. No, he was looking straight at me, his eyes unwavering. "Yeah?" I responded, my voice sounding far more unsteady than I'd intended. My heart was beating faster now, the moment stretching out before me like a heavy weight. "I need to tell you something," he said, taking a step closer. I felt my breath catch in my throat, unsure whether I wanted him to get any closer or if I wanted to run the other direction. But I couldn't look away, and I knew there was no escaping whatever was coming next. My hands shook slightly as I set the dish I'd been drying on the counter. "What is it, Ethan?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. He took another step forward, and this time I didn't pull back. His presence was overwhelming, like a storm gathering in the distance. He was so close now, I could feel the heat of his body, the same warmth that had been slowly building between us for weeks. I've been thinking about something," he began, his voice low and almost tentative, as if he was choosing each word carefully. "I don't know how to say this, but I've been feeling something for a while now, something I can't ignore anymore." I felt my chest tighten, a lump forming in my throat. I knew what he was about to say, but I wasn't prepared for it. Not like this. Not in the middle of a quiet evening when everything seemed so normal. My mind raced, but my body was frozen, caught in the moment, unsure whether I should say something or remain silent. Ethan hesitated, his eyes searching mine for any sign that I might understand. "I don't know when it happened, but somewhere along the way I started feeling differently about you, about us." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady, but it was impossible. My thoughts were spiraling, trying to make sense of the words he was saying, trying to find some way to respond without shattering everything between us. "Ethan," I breathed, my voice breaking slightly. "What do you mean?" I hated how fragile I sounded, how vulnerable, but I couldn't help it. He stepped closer, his breath now mingling with mine, and I could see the intensity in his eyes. He wasn't joking. He wasn't trying to make light of the situation. This was real, and it hit me like a punch to the gut. "I mean," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I'm in love with you, Grace." The words hit me like a wave crashing over me, sweeping away everything I thought I knew about the world. I stumbled back, my hand gripping the counter for support. I had to be hearing things. He couldn't be saying this to me. Not Ethan, not my stepson. But his eyes, those dark, intense eyes, told me everything. He wasn't joking. He wasn't confused. He was serious. And the weight of his confession sank in like a stone in my chest. I tried to speak, to form words, but nothing came out. The room felt like it was closing in on me, the air thick with the heavy silence between us. All I could hear was the pounding of my heart, each beat a reminder that things between us had changed forever. "I didn't want to feel this way," Ethan said, his voice strained now. "But I couldn't keep it in anymore. I don't know what to do, but I couldn't hide it from you, Grace." I stared at him, my mind struggling to catch up with what had just been said. I should have told him this was wrong, that it was impossible, that we were family and nothing should ever cross that line. But instead, all I could do was stand there, paralyzed by the overwhelming emotions flooding through me. His confession hung in the air like a dangerous secret, one that neither of us could take back. I wasn't sure what to say or how to handle this new, painful reality. I wanted to tell him it couldn't happen, that it was wrong, that I was his stepmother. But as I stood there, looking into his eyes, I realized that telling him that would be the hardest thing I'd ever done, because part of me didn't want to let go of the connection that was growing between us. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy, until I finally spoke, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what to say, Ethan." And that was all I could manage, the words hanging in the air as I tried to understand how my life had just been upended in one simple confession. The family had planned a weekend getaway for months, a cabin in the mountains, tucked away from the world. It was meant to be a time for relaxation, a time to recharge and reconnect. But for me, it felt like a pressure cooker ready to explode. I could feel it in the air, the unspoken tension that had been building for weeks between Ethan and me. And now, it was about to reach a breaking point. The morning was sunny but cool, with a crisp breeze that cut through the trees, sending golden leaves tumbling to the ground. Ethan and I had spent the early part of the day hiking along the narrow trails, the forest alive with the sounds of birds and distant rustling. At first, it was just like any other hike, me chatting away about trivial things, trying to ignore the weight in my chest. But as we ventured further, things began to shift. There was a quiet, subtle change in the way we moved together. His pace matched mine, step for step, and we found ourselves walking side by side more often than not. The air between us was thick with unspoken words, the space between us filled with a tension I couldn't shake. The trail narrowed, forcing us to walk single file for a while, and I felt his presence close behind me, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Every so often, I'd glance back to make sure he was still there, and every time, I'd catch him looking at me, his eyes dark and intense. It was as though there was nothing else in the world but the two of us, trapped in this moment. After about an hour of walking, we came to a small clearing by a stream, the sound of rushing water filling the space around us. We sat on a large rock near the edge, both of us tired but unwilling to break the silence. Ethan looked over at me, his expression unreadable. He had that same look I'd seen in his eyes the night he confessed, vulnerable yet determined. It made my heart race in a way I couldn't control. "I'm glad we did this," he said finally, his voice quiet, but there was an edge to it that made me nervous. "Yeah, it's nice to get away," I replied, my throat dry. My fingers instinctively twisted the hem of my jacket, a nervous habit I had when I was unsure how to respond. He didn't say anything at first, just watched me, the weight of his gaze pressing down on me. I shifted uncomfortably under the intensity of it. "You know," Ethan said after a moment, his voice low, "I've been thinking a lot about what we talked about." My stomach twisted at the mention of his confession. The air felt heavier suddenly, and the reality of our situation pressed down on me like a vice. I didn't want to talk about it, but I couldn't bring myself to stop him. "I've been thinking about it too," I said, my voice betraying my unease. "Maybe we should just leave it where it is. It's not something that can happen, Ethan." He shifted closer to me, his face inches away now. I could smell the scent of fresh pine, and his cologne mixed together, a heady combination that made my heart race. "Grace," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "I can't forget it. I can't just pretend like nothing happened." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. The truth was I didn't know what I wanted. Part of me wanted to push him away, to remind him of all the reasons this was wrong. But another part, a part of me I couldn't control, wanted to give in. My body betrayed me. The closeness between us, the way his hand brushed against mine, felt so right in a way I couldn't explain. He placed his hand on mine, the touch light at first, testing, and I didn't pull away. I should have, but I didn't. The moment felt like it was hanging in the balance, teetering on the edge of something both dangerous and forbidden. I could feel my pulse racing, my body betraying every rational thought that told me this was wrong. "I can't stop thinking about you," Ethan murmured, his voice rough with emotion. He didn't look away, his gaze unwavering. "I don't want to stop thinking about you." The world seemed to fall away as I stared into his eyes, caught between what I knew I should do and what I desperately wanted. In that moment, the space between us, the boundaries that should have been there, didn't seem to matter. It was just him and me, alone in this clearing, the rest of the world far away. But then, just as quickly as it had come, the moment passed. The sounds of the forest returned, the wind picking up and ruffling through the trees. I snapped back to reality, feeling the weight of what was happening settle in my chest like a stone. I pulled my hand away, my breath shallow and uneven. "Ethan, stop," I whispered, my voice shaky. "This isn't right." He didn't move at first, his hand still outstretched, as though he was waiting for me to change my mind. But I couldn't. I couldn't let this go any further, no matter how much I wanted to. The consequences would be too much to bear. "I know," he said softly, his voice thick with something I couldn't name. "I just wanted you to know that I can't help how I feel." And that was it. The boundary between us had been crossed, whether I wanted it to be or not. We were standing on the edge of something irreversible, and I wasn't sure either of us could turn back. The days following our weekend trip were nothing short of surreal. Ethan and I had shared moments, quiet, secret moments, that seemed to rewrite the rules of our relationship. And now, back in the house with Mark, everything felt heavier, like the air itself was thicker, charged with the unspoken tension that neither Ethan nor I could deny. I told myself that nothing had changed, that things would go back to normal. But deep down I knew better. The line we'd crossed couldn't be uncrossed, and as hard as I tried to push the feelings away, they lingered in the back of my mind like an itch I couldn't scratch. Mark, my husband, wasn't blind. He wasn't stupid. He had always prided himself on being the kind of guy who could pick up on subtle cues, on the way people acted when something was off. And now it seemed something was off between me and Ethan, though I didn't know exactly how much he'd noticed. It started with the small things. Ethan wasn't quite as distant as he used to be. He would linger in the kitchen when he knew I was cooking, leaning casually against the counter, asking me questions about dinner, or offering to help with little tasks. His presence, once a background noise, now felt like an anchor in the room. I'd caught myself finding excuses to have him around, even if I didn't want to admit it. One night after dinner, as Mark and I cleared the table together, Ethan hung around the kitchen, hovering near the doorway, his eyes on me in a way that made me squirm. It wasn't overt, but I felt it. His gaze, warm and soft, tracing the curve of my back as I bent to pick up a dish. I tried to ignore it, to carry on with the motions of my life as if everything was the same. But then Mark, with his usual unassuming sharpness, broke the moment. "You and Ethan seem to be getting along a lot better these days," he remarked casually, his back to both of us as he wiped down the counter. His voice was light, but there was an edge to it, like he wasn't asking for a report, but simply stating an observation. I froze, my hand midair as I reached for a dish. The words felt like a punch in the gut. I hadn't even realized how much I'd let slip, how much of the unspoken connection between Ethan and me had begun to show in small ways. Ethan, always quick on his feet, answered with a smile, trying to play it off. "Yeah, I guess we're just spending more time together. Helping out around here, you know? It's nice." But it didn't sound natural. It didn't sound like Ethan. It sounded rehearsed. And when I turned to glance at him, I saw the flicker of something in his eyes. A hint of nervousness mixed with something else I couldn't quite place. Mark didn't seem to press the issue further, but the tension lingered like a shadow in the room. I could feel the weight of his eyes as he shifted uncomfortably, a slight frown appearing on his face as he finished cleaning up. I had no idea if he knew what was really going on, or if he was just picking up on something more subtle, something that made him uneasy without quite understanding why. But one thing was clear: the balance of our family life was beginning to shift. The next day, things were no better. Ethan's presence around the house seemed to intensify, and with it, so did the unease. He was always nearby, whether he was fixing something in the garden or sitting on the porch reading a book. The small everyday moments felt charged with something forbidden, something neither of us wanted to acknowledge, yet neither of us could escape. One evening, I found myself sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone while Ethan sat across from me in the armchair. We had fallen into an awkward silence. Neither of us had said much for a while, but the air between us was thick, and I knew Ethan was doing everything he could to keep his emotions in check. His eyes kept flicking to me, watching me out of the corner of his eye, and every time I looked up, our gazes would lock for a brief moment before I quickly looked away. There was no escaping it. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to say something. "Ethan, we need to be careful. Mark's noticing things. People are going to start asking questions." My voice was tight, a thin thread of panic slipping through. "We can't let this thing between us go any further." Ethan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he just stared at me, his expression unreadable. I waited for him to protest, to argue that nothing was wrong, that everything was fine. But he didn't. Instead, he stood up slowly, moving to sit beside me on the couch. His proximity sent a shiver through me, but I refused to let it show. "We're just talking," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper. "We don't have to do anything more than that." I nodded, though his words did nothing to ease the knot in my stomach, because I knew deep down that the lines had already been blurred. We had already crossed a threshold, and the more we tried to pretend that everything was fine, the more obvious it became that things had changed, and not just for me. Ethan wasn't the only one feeling it. I was too. The next few days were a blur of moments that should have been normal. Simple, everyday things that were now tangled with unsaid words and stolen glances. Mark was around, but even he seemed distracted, like he could sense the shift in the air. His comments, though innocent, made me question whether he was beginning to see through the veil of our normalcy. In one instance, after dinner, I noticed Mark was watching me and Ethan carefully while we cleaned up together. It wasn't obvious, but there was something in the way he watched us, his eyes flicking from Ethan to me and then away again, that made me wonder if he was beginning to put the pieces together. I quickly turned my attention back to the dishes, trying to focus on something, anything other than the tension that was thickening with each passing second. It was becoming clear that Ethan and I were no longer just two people living in the same house. We were two people who shared something deeper, something that, while still unspoken, was beginning to shape the way we moved through the world. And though neither of us wanted to admit it, our actions, our words, the way we looked at each other, everything was telling a story that neither of us was prepared to tell. And Mark, whether he realized it or not, was starting to notice that story too. The night started like any other. Mark was out with friends, a rare evening of freedom for both of us. Ethan and I were home alone, just like before, but tonight felt different. Maybe it was the way the air felt thicker, more suffocating, or maybe it was just the buildup of the past few weeks, the secret looks, the moments that lingered a bit too long, the conversations that danced dangerously close to something more. We had just finished dinner, and I found myself washing the dishes while Ethan settled on the couch, his eyes on me as I moved about the kitchen. I could feel the weight of his gaze on my back, and it made my pulse race. We didn't speak much, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was full of things we weren't saying. "Do you need help?" Ethan asked, breaking the quiet. I glanced over my shoulder, forcing a smile. "No, it's fine. Just a few more things to clean up." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he got up from the couch and walked toward the kitchen. My stomach tightened, and for a moment I couldn't focus on anything else but the sound of his footsteps, the closeness of his presence. I turned to face him as he leaned against the doorway, his eyes fixed on me. "You've been working a lot lately," he said, his voice low. "Maybe you should take a break. Let me help." I didn't know what it was about his voice, but there was a smoothness to it tonight, like he wasn't just talking about dishes anymore. I felt it in the pit of my stomach, a gnawing sensation I couldn't ignore. I tried to shake it off, turning back to the sink, pretending to focus on the task at hand. "I'm fine, Ethan. Really, just need to finish up." I muttered, my voice a little too sharp. But he didn't leave. Instead, he stepped closer, just a few feet away, and I could feel his presence pressing in on me. I could smell the faint trace of cologne on his skin, the warm, comforting scent of something familiar, something that made everything inside me want to lean in. My hand froze on the dish I was washing, the soap suds slipping from my fingers. I didn't dare look up, afraid of what might happen if I did. But Ethan didn't seem to care about the space between us. He reached out, his fingers brushing mine as he gently took the dish from my hand. The simple touch sent a jolt through me, and for a second I couldn't breathe. I looked up then, our eyes locking in a silent moment that said more than words ever could. "Grace," he whispered, his voice hushed, his breath warm against my ear. "Are you sure you're okay?" I didn't answer right away. What could I say? That I wasn't okay? That the line we were skirting around, dancing close to, felt like it was about to shatter? That I wanted to give in to the pull between us, even though I knew it was wrong? I couldn't admit that. Not to him, not to myself. "I'm fine, Ethan," I said quietly, but the words didn't sound convincing, even to my own ears. I took a step back, trying to break the tension, but he followed me, his eyes never leaving mine. The next few moments were a blur. He stepped closer, closing the distance between us, and I felt his warmth against my skin. The air in the room was thick with something unspoken, something that neither of us could deny any longer. Our breaths quickened as we stood there, inches apart, our bodies barely touching but feeling as though we were magnetized. I could feel his heart beating as fast as mine. "Grace." Ethan's voice trembled slightly, as if he was fighting the urge to say something more. I knew what he was thinking, what he wanted. I could see it in the way his eyes roamed over my face, my lips. Everything in me screamed to step back, to put some distance between us, but I couldn't move. I couldn't pull away. Suddenly, just as the moment seemed to stretch endlessly, the sound of the front door opening shattered the tension. Mark had come home earlier than expected. Ethan quickly pulled away, his face flushed with a mix of confusion and panic. I took a step back too, trying to compose myself, to regain some semblance of control. Mark appeared in the doorway, his presence a stark contrast to the intensity of the moment that had just passed. "Hey, what's going on in here?" he asked, his tone casual. But I noticed the way his eyes flickered between us, the suspicion lingering behind them. I forced a smile, trying to mask the rush of emotion surging through me. "Nothing, just cleaning up. Everything's fine," I replied, my voice a little too high-pitched. Ethan said nothing. He simply nodded, his eyes quickly averting from mine, as if he knew how close we had come to something we couldn't take back. Mark didn't seem to press it any further, but I could tell he was curious. And for the first time, I wondered just how much he was noticing, how much he was reading between the lines. As the evening wore on, the closeness that had nearly consumed me faded into the background. But the truth was, it was still there, lingering between us, unspoken but undeniable. The moment we'd almost crossed, the line that had been drawn between us had shifted, and now I couldn't ignore it any longer. Ethan and I both knew that nothing could go back to the way it was. The near miss had only made it more clear. Something had changed. The days that followed were a blur of conflicting emotions, each one more confusing than the last. It was like walking in a fog, where every step felt uncertain, and the ground beneath me was shaky. The tension between Ethan and me had reached a point where it could no longer be ignored. It was out there now, clear as day, and no amount of pretending could make it go away. I had tried. I really had. I tried to maintain my composure, to keep my focus on the ordinary tasks of life. But every time Ethan looked at me, every time his voice dropped a little lower, or his hand brushed against mine, it became harder to ignore the ache building inside me. The moments we had shared, the near touch, the quiet exchanges, had etched themselves into my mind, and no matter how hard I tried to push them aside, they wouldn't go away. One evening after dinner, I found myself sitting in the living room with him. Mark had gone to bed early as usual. We were alone again, and the silence between us was more oppressive than before. I could feel Ethan's eyes on me, that quiet, searching look that I knew so well by now. It made my skin prickle, my heart race. "Grace," Ethan said, breaking the silence with a soft, almost hesitant tone. "We need to talk." I looked up at him, my stomach fluttering in that familiar way, the way it always did when he spoke like that. I could feel my pulse quicken, but I kept my expression neutral, even though inside I was anything but calm. "What about?" I asked, my voice betraying me with a slight tremor. He paused, his lips pressing into a thin line as if he was deciding how to say what was on his mind. "About us," he said quietly. "About everything." My heart skipped a beat. I knew exactly what he meant. This conversation had been inevitable, and yet I wasn't prepared for it. Not really. "Ethan, we can't." My words faltered. I had to stop this. I knew I had to. The last thing I wanted was for this to go any further, for us to step across a line we couldn't undo. But Ethan wasn't backing down. His voice was firm now, but it still held that hint of uncertainty. "I know this isn't easy. I know it's complicated. But I can't keep pretending, Grace. I can't ignore how I feel anymore." He paused, searching my face for a reaction, for some sign that I felt the same. I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words pressing down on me. I wanted to tell him it was wrong, that we couldn't go down this path, that this was something that should never have even been a thought between us. But the words wouldn't come. Because deep down, I knew I wasn't as certain as I pretended to be. The truth was, I did feel something for him. I had felt it for a while now, and pretending I didn't was only getting harder. "Ethan, we can't," I repeated. But this time, my voice was softer, quieter, as if I was trying to convince myself more than him. This isn't right." "But why?" His eyes were searching, desperate for an answer, for something concrete. "Why can't it be right? You feel it too, don't you?" His words hung in the air, heavy and bold. "I know you do. I see it in the way you look at me, in the way you act around me. I can feel it." I stared at him, my mind racing. He was right. I had felt it. I had noticed the way my heart raced when he was near, the way my thoughts strayed when he smiled at me, the way every touch felt electric. But I couldn't let myself admit it, not fully, not without tearing apart everything I had worked so hard to protect. I stood up abruptly, my heart pounding in my chest. "Ethan, please, you need to stop," I said, my voice more forceful now, though it wavered with the underlying emotion I was trying to suppress. "You need to stop before this goes any further." Ethan didn't move, didn't step back. He just looked at me with those intense eyes, filled with a mixture of hurt and frustration. "I can't stop, Grace," he said softly. "I can't pretend anymore." The room felt like it was closing in on me. My breath was shallow, my chest tight, as I realized that this was the moment where I would have to choose, to either shut this down completely or to let it continue, knowing full well what it would mean for both of us. I wanted to tell him everything I was feeling. I wanted to confess that I wasn't sure I could resist him much longer, but I couldn't. I couldn't let this be the path I walked down, not with everything I had to lose. "Please, Ethan," I said, my voice breaking, the weight of the situation hitting me all at once. "We have to stop this, for both of our sakes." There was a long silence, and for a moment, it felt like the world had stopped spinning. I watched Ethan's expression shift, the frustration in his eyes fading, replaced by something softer, sadness maybe, understanding. He nodded slowly, his lips pressed tight, and without another word, he turned and walked out of the room. As the door clicked softly behind him, I sank back into the couch, feeling the emptiness settle in. I had made my decision, and yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. It couldn't be. The lines between us had already blurred too much, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, that feeling, the one I was so desperate to avoid, would never go away.